Okay, here we go. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us in this debate of the future of higher education. We're very happy that to say that we've had really good sign up. Over 80 people have signed up to join us and have contributed to questions in the registration form, and we have, I think, by my count, 14 universities represented here as well. So this is clearly a topic that a lot of us are worrying about. Next slide, please, Marvin. So just to remind everyone that as of now, we will start recording this event. Marvin, am I clicking record or are you? Okay, Marvin is going to start recording this event. So this is going to be recorded so that people who cannot be present but are interested in this discussion can watch it at a later date. The event is also being live tweeted by a number of us, and if you want to join in on the Twitter discussion, please include the Young Academy of Scotland and the Royal Society of Edinburgh handles, as well as our hashtag tertiary eds futures. And the other thing that we're hoping to do at the end of this is to synthesize this discussion into both a report and hopefully also a newspaper article. And we also hope to keep the conversation going after this event, but more on that later on. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to say, around a year ago, a number of Young Academy of Scotland members, me and Alice in particular, started discussing this idea of having a debate about the future of higher education. We're all very aware that there's a number of trends ongoing, and we kind of felt that it would be important that the voices of those of us who are at the coalface of higher education, who are actively engaged in delivering higher education, these voices were also part of the conversation about what the future should look like. And we used to share buildings on corridors and coffee breaks, so we would hear things like talking about student expectations. Next, please. The internationalization of higher education. Next. The development of new curricula. Next. Student experience. How higher education interfaces with research. Also worries about the marketization of higher education. We talk about novel teaching methods and how they impact the way in which we deliver higher education. We also discuss things like academic freedom and as well as the public perception of the value that higher education provides. And all of this, when we started discussing what was it exactly that was the essence of all these discussions, we kind of converged on this idea that if we wanted to plan the future of higher education, we needed to be able to articulate clearly what its purpose is. And so we thought that we would crowdsource this articulation by starting a debate with practitioners about all of these things. And then, of course, COVID hit us, and we, like, for a moment we were like, what do we do? Do we stop all this? But we actually felt that it was COVID-19 made these discussions more urgent, because it meant that we're now forced to adapt very quickly, and without necessarily considering that whether the changes we're making whether they're adaptive or whether actually detrimental to our purpose. And so we felt that instead of cancelling this event, we'd just find a different way of delivering it, and here we are. So in addition to this, there's a wider context within the Royal Society of Edinburgh that this will fit into, and now I pass on to Alice, who's going to explain that a little bit better than me.
As Maria has said, we actually began thinking about this some time ago. So in 2019, the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Young Academy of Scotland started getting together to plan quite a wide-ranging project on the future of tertiary education in Scotland. So not just higher education, but thinking about further education and higher education together, how they articulate and so on, and some of the really big issues about their future in what at the time we thought was already a rapidly changing and unpredictable future. So we were going to look into funding, the organisation of higher and further education, student demographics, already challenging before COVID, obviously, changes in curricula and in teaching and learning methodologies. And of course, COVID has since arrived and completely accelerated conversations about all of that, made it all the more urgent to think about the future of tertiary education in the round, higher education specifically today. There's obviously a huge amount of contingency planning, a huge amount of crisis management and response. But what we really want to do today is look well beyond that and ask the big question that Maria has identified about what is higher education for, what should it be for in the future, who does it serve, what is the public perception of the value it adds to society, and so on. While RSE and Young Academy of Scotland are working very much together on this future of tertiary education project, the real contribution that Yaz wants to make is bringing in the practitioner voice. We've lost count of the number of consultations we've actually been involved in where, management are involved, students are involved, but the practitioners, the people at the coalface, are often, their voices aren't amplified. And practitioners, teachers, researchers have been at the heart of one of the most profound educational experiments in living memory in the last few weeks, rapidly adapting to change. And we think it's absolutely vital to capture that experience, to capture those ideas and those concerns. And really, that's what we're trying to do today. All of this will feed into the wider project on the future of tertiary education and into the RSE's post-COVID-19 Futures Commission, and also into some Yaz work around COVID recovery in Scotland. But today's really all about scoping your concerns and ideas as practitioners so that we can set the agenda for future conversations.
Next slide, please, Marvin. Okay, so we have put together a panel. We're very grateful to these people who have joined us, and I will briefly introduce them. And as I do, can I please ask the panel to just unmute themselves and say hello so that their faces appear on the right side of our screens. So first of all, we have Professor Clare Peddie. Claire?
Hello everyone, I'm really glad to be here. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
So Clare is the proctor, the vice principal for education at the University of St Andrews, and she brings us both the perspective of someone who's very much involved at the coalface. Clare still teaches. In fact, she was in the middle of teaching an intense course when the COVID-19 crisis hit, but also the perspective of university administration. We're also joined by Professor Paul Hibbert. Paul, can you please say hello?
Sure, hello, glad to be here.
Thank you, Paul. So Paul is a professor at the School of Management at the University of St Andrews, and his research is on collaborative and relational processes in organizing and learning, so evidently some very, very relevant skills to this discussion as well. We're also joined by Professor Richard Whatmore. Richard, can you please say hello?
Hello, and thanks for organising everything. And again, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, Richard. So Richard is a modern historian, also at the University of St Andrews, and his specific research interest on the history of intellectualism is evidently very, very relevant for this discussion, because we need to have a look at the history of universities so we can plan for their future. We're also joined by Dr. Anita Laidlaw. Anita, can you please say hello?
Hello everyone, looking forward to an interesting discussion.
Thank you, Anita. So Anita is the co-director of the Centre for Higher Education Research here at the University of St Andrews, and so she actually represents research into the topic of higher education, how to deliver it and how to take it forward. And now I'm keeping my fingers crossed that Peter has actually joined us. Peter?
I'm here.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much, Peter, for joining us. Peter is a fellow member of the Young Academy of Scotland, He's head of policy for Scotland at Leicester, and he also brings us his former experience as vice president of the Student Association and later rector at the University of Edinburgh.
Gosh, I think I'd forgotten about being vice president of the Students' Association.
But Wikipedia hasn't, so. Okay, so we have a brilliant panel joining us, and I'm going to maybe start with a question from the forms that the people here have filled on the topic of academic freedom. So the question comes from Amanda Seed, and she asks, does the panel agree that making students pay for their education restricts academic freedom? I think it forces us into a marketplace where how we research and teach has to have commercial appeal and limits our ability to make decisions based on principles because we have to compete for financial viability. Does someone in the panel want to respond to this?
I'm quite happy to respond, because I think that, as with pretty much everything, it's more complicated than that. And if you opt for the ideal model in which universities did not have to compete for resources and everything was free, I think that would be paradise, obviously, and it would be wonderful for people to have, what I experienced, which was not having to pay a penny. But I think you have to also remember that probably, even though it's hard to admit, the fees have saved us. If you look at the fee regime in England has saved the English universities. Obviously, I'm talking about it's different in Scotland, obviously. But if you look at what's happening, especially south of the border, with a lot of schools, with the turning of them into academies, and the sacking of teachers that is occurring, teachers who've been long-standing teachers because they're more expensive, the use of whiteboards, so you have general presentations that anybody can teach in the same academy school, 6 schools at the same time. I know about this because actually my sister, who teaches in a comprehensive school in Sunderland, was made redundant. She and the other person who had 20 years experience, because they were just too expensive. And I think the worry about populist governments, which is probably something we'll come back to, is that if they're in charge of the purse strings, if there's no independent source of income, then they can do all sorts of stuff. And you'll know problems in Hungary at the moment that are pretty intense. The danger of the everything is free system, to me, is that it allows the people who hold the purse strings to do whatever they want. The benefit of some kind of fee regime can be that you have a little bit more wiggle room stroke independence. And so I don't see the discussion in binary terms. I'd love a government to write a permanent check on the grounds of we're just so important. But then we'd start battling about which areas are the most important, etc. And it would depend who within the universities or held the purse strings again. So I just want to say that you have to be careful, because we're dependent on resource, and when we're dependent on resource, there's always a silver lining, and there's always unintended consequences to whatever fee regime you've got.
So that's a very good point, actually, which I hadn't considered before. I mean, there is always someone holding the purse strings. It's either government or whoever's in charge of the budget, or it might be students, but someone is always in charge of where the money is coming from. However, there's a number of questions. In fact, it's probably like the most popular theme that came through the questions we've had so far on the topic of marketization of higher education. How that has made a lot of the discourse about higher education center around money, and this is a question that comes from Margaret Hughes, and whether this is representative of ideological misinformation on the true purpose of higher education. So do we see these two things as being mutually exclusive, and do we see a competition between a narrative that's just money focused versus a higher value that's associated to higher education?
Perhaps I can jump in there if that's okay. From my point of view, I think the underlying debate is about the role of students in shaping their own education. So I think the value that Richard was highlighting of students having some say in the matter gives some independence to the framework in which education is constructed. But also, I think students don't just vote with their checkbooks, they vote with their choices around subjects and disciplines, and they don't always pick the economic advantageous choice, to be honest with you. So there's something else going on there. So I think we have to respect that students will want a career at the end of this, especially in the hard times that are coming. That's got to be something that we support, but also bear in mind the other things that students want. So even if there is a financial mechanism underlying things, there are other principles that still have their say, and students are our best advocates in making that happen.
Maria, can I add to the debate a little bit? I think so. One of my concerns about attaching fees to payment for a degree, if you want to term it in such blatant terms, is not around the marketisation, but about the equity of access. My concern there is that any fee-paying structure needs to incorporate within it an ability for students who have not got the wherewithal to be able to pay for their education, to be sure that they've got an alternative process. And I think at the moment we have a situation in Scotland where the fee and the SAS support is not sufficient for a student to be able to access education in a comfortable situation, and that concerns me a lot. So whilst I sit on the fence slightly about whether students should pay for education or not, where I definitely would like to come down is that whatever system we have in the future higher education in the UK, that we address the inequity of access.
That's an excellent point, Claire, actually, and maybe to elaborate a little bit on that, I think historically, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but higher education has been instrumental in promoting social mobility, and so I would argue that this is one of the values of higher education, and so I wondered if the panel want to elaborate a little bit on that as well.
I just wanted to come in with a little bit about that previous point, and I think it connects to your question, Maria. So when I was rector at Edinburgh University, we made a commitment to really dealing with student mental health. And it was a really serious issue at the time. And I've no doubt continues to be. And every year we were pouring more and more money into the counselling service. And still they couldn't keep up with demand. And when we kind of drilled down underneath that, it was very clear to me that the students who were feeling the most pressure and who were having the most, who were having pressure points put on their mental health were those who were having to work most. And that was to do with a lack of student support. So some students had the family background where they were able to come to university, they could focus on university, and that made their experience generally a much better one. There are a lot of students who, under the pressure of a support regime that wasn't strong enough, but also under the pressure of incurring enormous fees, were working sometimes 20, sometimes 25 hours a week. And that was putting enormous pressure on their mental health and was driving them into seeking counselling and other appropriate measures for that. Now, what that kind of says to me is that it's really, really important that we get that support right, but that it's also really, really important actually for the core values that we would want to uphold, that we're funding people properly to be at university. And I think for me, one of the really interesting things about this is that not only did fees begin to introduce that pressure on students to work more, but they also transformed the relationship to one that was much more transactional. And I think that's been quite problematic. And you look at demands now from students for their fees back because they haven't been able to get taught in person, and it really transformed the experience, I think, of a lot of students at university to one that was about what services they were receiving rather than it being about a learning experience.
Yes, I think that is reflected by one of the questions that's just coming through the chat, where Oscar Gaggiotti is making that the point is not so much that a fee, the free system or a fee paying system, is that all the marketization changes that come associated to that, which are ideologically driven more than necessarily a consequence of the fees themselves. And also Miguel Barbosa also comments that university also have the role of being socially inclusive. And again, I would ask if the panel wants to comment on these two things.
Maybe I could jump in here. And I guess it depends what we think of as the outcomes of university. And I'm not sure that the outcomes that we as academics think of coming from university are necessarily the same as what students think of as the outcomes for university. So my sense is that students are more centred and focused on the qualification that they achieve and the potential that then brings to their lives. And that may be related to social inclusion and enhanced prospects. But I suspect from our practitioner perspective, we're looking more at the life skills that they might learn along the way whilst at university as the outcome.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point. Another question that's coming through the chat is focusing back again to the point that Peter made before about mental health, and I guess I wanted to I wanted us to reflect a little bit on what this means in with the current changes, because campuses used to be very much part of the university experience. Campus teaching is, let's put it this way, uncertain at best, unlikely at worst. What does this mean in terms of consequences for the mental health of our student body?
So I can maybe talk a little bit about that from a sort of immediate experience perspective, in that we've been obviously monitoring very closely how active student services are right now with respect to students and their mental health situation through the actual current COVID crisis. What's interesting is that many students have actually, in this current situation, have returned home back to their families. And what this has created is almost a bimodal response, in that students that are returning home to a supportive home environment have actually found their mental health improving because they're with their families and they feel less stressed and able. They usually find the university experience quite stressful, so they've actually improved. And then there's another cohort of students who are actually returning to an environment which is not supportive, and an environment where indeed they might not actually be all that safe. And so they have responded negatively and have required the support of our student services. So it's interesting that whilst we haven't got an upturn in requests for support, what we have seen is a change in the types of people that are actually accessing our student services. So the people that were needing support when they were at university don't need support anymore, and the ones that were fine at university are now needing support. So it's interesting what's happening.
Thank you, Claire. That's very, very useful. Another question that's coming through the chat is on the topic, which is related to all this, on the topic of whether or not higher education is a human right. And this is kind of a complicated question, because I mean, even in countries like the UK, where a fair proportion of the population goes to higher education, goes on and does higher education, not everyone does, right? And we do have selective entries to our higher education, and I wonder if we could take a second to debate this. Is higher education for everybody, for everybody who wants to do it? Is there any role for selection, and how do we do this? How do we make it fair for not just the people who come through higher education, but the rest of the population as well?
I'll jump in if that's helpful, to give more intelligent people than me to think of a better answer, if nothing else. For me, I think it's aspirational to have higher education as a human right. It's something we should work towards as an aim, absolutely. We have to bear in mind the situation in countries other than the UK that are much worse off than we are, where giving the idea of that as a human right that can be enacted for people may feel challenging, to say the least. I don't know if you're familiar with that old radio advertisement that had this kind of rhythm to it. Do you remember this one? There was a snapping finger in the background. And that's the rate at which people die from hunger in the world. Quite frightening, isn't it? So when we think of human rights and prioritising those, yes, higher education is one we should work towards, but let's look at some of the fundamental problems in the world first, is my perspective.
So I think at a period of really fundamental technological change, it's important to note that what higher education gives very many people will be the ability to contribute to the world to the maximum, to make a really substantial contribution to the world, to put them in a position where they can begin to realize their full potential. And I think when you're seeing jobs being automated out of existence, which I think we're going to see, and you see those tasks being driven up the value scale. So we're going to move from, I mean, the classic example is the spreadsheet. So that when they invented the spreadsheet, what happened was not that there were fewer people in financial control, but that there were more people making use of the information now available to them through spreadsheets. And I think we're going to begin to see that right the way across the workplace. And those skills, the skills that are required, are not the old skills of bookkeeping in this analogy, but the new skills of management accountancy and understanding exactly where money comes from and where it's going to and how you can manage it best. And I think that requires us to have really open access to higher education, because in order for people not just to get the fulfillment out of their own lives that we know that higher education can give them, but also to contribute to society in the way that we need them to, they're going to need much higher skills. And it's going to be about the sorts of skills that people find in higher education. To be absolutely clear, I also think we're going to need many more people with technical skills, and many more people to have technical skills around electronics and understanding how it is that the technology works. So I think in that context, while preventing premature death in the global south is really important, I think there's a technological change coming that's going to sort a lot of those things out. What we need to do is look to the future and see just how it is we can build in higher education as a way of maximizing people's potential.
Right, so that was exactly one of the questions that we had in the chat as well. So is the purpose of higher education to maximize people's potential? And if so, are we really geared to get the best out of everyone? Or are we based on some outdated models of higher education, of education and teaching?
Does anybody else want to come in on that?
Maybe I could jump in a little bit there. I guess it's what we mean by maximising people's potential, and we've already highlighted that that student well-being is a source of concern in higher education, and the maximising people's potential has to take maximising their well-being into account as well. And I'm not sure at the moment that we've got that balance in a helpful way.
I think Claire also wanted to say something.
Yes, I did. I think Peter sort of said, "Is the model?" Or there was a point. Is the model broken? And I think that at the moment, through the current crisis, many of us have had to make huge transitions into the way that we teach, the tools that we use to teach. But the fundamental model of higher education, where we have academics at the forefront of their research, at developing knowledge and bringing students on that journey with them, and sharing that that goal of exploration, and also asking students to critically analyze the information that they have in front of them and find and search for truth. That fundamental model around about higher education, I would argue, certainly isn't broken.
Yes,
Can I come in about going back to the issue of rights and what we should be doing more generally, which is that when you're talking about rights, you have to go back to Jeremy Bentham in the French Revolution when he called it nonsense on stilts. And the reason that he called rights nonsense on stilts is because the French revolutionaries, just like the American revolutionaries, had had the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And as soon as you'd had the obsession with rights, then they all start killing each other, and you have the terror. Obviously, in the American Revolution, you have declarations of rights, but then it doesn't apply to women fully. It doesn't apply to slaves. So I think the discourse of rights really is just sidesteps the true issue, which is we probably in this discussion all think that higher education is fantastic and it's really important, and all the things that we do are marvelous, but it's the people who hold the purse strings who are going to say, okay, only certain STEM subjects are worth doing. They'll probably be aware that right across Europe at the moment, as probably everybody knows, there are more and more courses being put on for students in English, so they can go and do cheap degree programs. I think the fees in the Netherlands at the moment are about 2,000 a year, 2,000 euros. Obviously, they'll go up after Brexit for UK students. And I think we're in a more general time of crisis, and I think we do have to shout about the fact that education is transformative. The kinds of education that have traditionally been undertaken, you know, the revolution that has occurred in the last 30 years or so in terms of the move to mass education, the abandonment of the hierarchies with regard to polytechnics, etc. That's all been wonderful. But what we have to really be worried about is the marketization. It is also the focus on disciplines and the obsession with relevant disciplines and teaching core skills that are going to get students fantastic salaries into the future. I think we have to defend ourselves by saying, actually, it's something that everybody should experience, but I don't think assertion of rights is going to ever persuade the populists and the people who hold those purse strings. And they're the ones that we have to convince that what we're doing is good for society. One of the things I worry about is if you look at the, you know, who votes for certain political positions, you know, the people who've got a university education, they're not the ones who are voting for Trump, Brexit, etc. And in other words, they are the people who've gone to universities have a certain political position. That's, if you're a politician who wants to be elected into the future, that means you're going to be antagonistic towards the universities. That's something that kind of worries me. But more generally, the worry is competition from universities that are putting on degrees in English, that because the perception is Britain's gone mad, the education, it's under pressure, the faculty are under pressure. Why don't we persuade the students to get an education abroad? in a different institution. And historically, you know, there was a shift to Scotland in the 18th century. The Scottish universities replaced the Dutch. In some ways, I think the reverse is happening today, and it worries me.
Yeah, so that is another question that's coming through the chat as well, is this idea of whether the current situation will enhance competition or collaboration among universities. So similarly, as we see arguments for the boundaries between disciplines to be abolished, because, you know, the world's different, and a lot of us need to do things across disciplines and between disciplines, and you know, the same could be argued for, like, if we're doing most things online, then, you know, what do we need all these boundaries across institutions, and are we better off collaborating or competing? And that's where the market forces can come in and really change things, right? Panel.
So I can give a personal perspective on this. I think I was on a conference call last night with a number of other slightly exhaustive vice principal educations, and I would say that the current crisis has certainly led us to collaborate and work together on a number of issues, and to work together to lobby government, to work with the QAA, to work with all of the Office for Students down in England. We're all having to work, we're having to work together to try and influence how the sector emerges from this current crisis. And so I think at the moment we're all working together very strongly. I think what might happen slightly differently is what happens when the students arrive or don't arrive come the end of this summer. I think that will be a crux moment for us all, and at the moment we're all just looking to see how the current crisis is going to affect student recruitment going forward. It's just really difficult to know at this moment in time, but I would say overall we're working together very closely. I would say in Scotland, the Scottish universities are all working together very closely to ensure the future of the sector.
That is wonderful to hear.
Can I jump in here as well? So my background is in medical education, and I'm from a kind of practitioner still involved in that. I'm very aware of a huge amount of collaboration going along between the UK medical schools in terms of sharing resources and different ways of teaching as well. And I guess the point I'd like to make is, yes, we're sharing resources and that's fantastic, but each practitioner is using those resources in a slightly different way within their institution, and I think that's a good thing as well. So there's collaboration going on, but there's also still keeping those individual institutional identities as well.
Yes, it is a fine balance, isn't it? In that, you know, when you know, that we don't, like, in the name of collaboration, we don't end up with homogeneity, which is also not desirable, and you don't stamp out innovation in a process as well. So I think it's important to balance this ideas of collaboration with the ideas of freedom as well, which and these two things can sometimes compete with one another. Another question that's come in that goes back to a point that I think Richard was making before is whether the current crisis may actually enhance our ability to do transnational teaching, and specifically to do transnational teaching to places that have traditionally have less access to higher education, right? So there's a big discrepancy across the planet. I study biodiversity, and like one thing that strikes me is that the places on the planet with the highest biodiversity have the lowest level of higher education. So we have a real crisis in terms of where the experts are needed and where they actually are. So I wonder if the panel wants to comment on this as well.
One of the really interesting things for me here is to take again an industry example. In the late 19th century, they started replacing steam engines for running factories with electric engines, and what that was expected to do was deliver an enormous amount of efficiency, and it didn't really. They were more efficient, but they weren't much more efficient. And it was only when you begin to get the creation of the production line that electrification of industry really made a huge difference. And I think there's a really interesting question here for me around how it is that higher education has built in the technological change that we've had over the past 20 years, particularly with the internet. It kind of feels to me like we've switched out the steam engine, switched in the electric motor, and gained some efficiency from that. But since the creation of the Open University, there hasn't been a root and branch rethink of how it is that you do higher education that responds to now dramatically different technological trends and ability to communicate. And I think there's a really interesting set of questions around that. And I think that the sort of competition that we've seen in higher education up until the crisis, and it's really good to hear about a more collaborative approach, tends to push people away from that approach, because if you're increasing the stakes. If you get it wrong, you get it really badly wrong. And I wonder if we can't really engage in a process of thinking about what it is that we do. And I mean, I think in my opening comments, I talked about when I came to university, the university library was a fantastic resource that I'd never had access to before. To today's students, it looks like a harder to use version of Google. Now, they're wrong about that, but that's what it looks like to them. And I think we need to capture some of the learning from that and find ways in which we can, and some of this for me is around opening up access to the journal materials that aren't accessible. They're actually the least accessible bits of the internet now, and allowing people to get access to those in order to inform decisions and research and their approach to life. And I think there are really interesting questions about that, and those questions tend towards the global.
Yeah, so that a point has also come in, and it's I think amplified by COVID, but it was there before. Is this idea that access to information used to be quite hard, and universities were in part sort of gatekeepers to this access to information. And now information is very readily accessible, but so is this information, right? So the proliferation of fake news, and also people's information does not equal knowledge, and at all. Like in the same way as data does not equal information. There are steps in between all of this, and I wonder if we can take a moment to discuss the role of a digital world, and where universities fit in there, where our lectures are unlikely to be to compete well with, say, TED Talks, for example, which are now accessible to everyone. What is it that universities can provide that people can't access in different ways? Can we find a way to articulate that in a digital world?
Yes, I think that's an important question. And I just want to close off a previous point, if I may, that I seem to give the impression that I'm in favour of the marketisation of higher education, according to chat. I'm not at all, okay? So I just want to put that one to bed and then move on. I think what we need to look at in terms of the student experience is that about 10 years ago, we started to see the prevalence of MOOCs, the massive open online courses, and they were going to take over education completely, and they didn't. And it's partly because of the points you're making, Maria, that we can get information and resources quite effectively through these methods, but that doesn't complete the experience for us. So for me, as in my kind of preliminary talk, it's around two things. One is that people have a sense of vocation that's enacted in a university context. So if you're a scientist, it means something to be a scientist at a university and with other scientists. Or if you're a musician, similarly, you need to play together with other folks. So the challenge for us in terms of collaborating together is how we look at developing enabling technologies for these more social and vocational aspects. We've got the information, the learning outcomes lined up, and we can support people towards careers, which is helpful, but we haven't got the vocation and the more social enrichment lines really set up yet. And that's where we need to invest, I think, in collaborative educational research to make that happen.
That's an excellent point. Claire, were you wanting to say something as well?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on that very excellent point, and it's something that we're actually working really hard to address, is the overall student experience, both from a non-academic perspective and from an academic's perspective, and also it's all the interactions that happen on the fringe of the tutorial, the lecture, the laboratory. It's the informal conversations, it's the debates and the student societies, and the whole package of a student experience that gives us one reason that we feel quite confident that our students will come as soon as they're able, because that is about the whole university education as well. But it's also in the digital world, and in a circumstance where you might have students who need to access the university education digitally and not in person. How do you recreate those experiences? And that's a challenge that I've laid down for a number of people to go away and think about.
Can I just add a little further point onto that, if I may?
Yeah.
It's all greatly encouraging. I think it's also another opportunity for international collaboration here. If we have students isolated in places they weren't expected to be, can we work with other institutions and perhaps with alumni communities to develop local community wherever it happens to be and support groups that way? So I think some of that kind of interaction could happen in a number of distributed models. Take a lot of work, but I think there are possibilities.
Well, interestingly, Paul, I mean, not internationally yet, but that sort of work for our digitally isolated students that perhaps can't travel to university, that reciprocal arrangement where I'll look after your students if you look after mine is already starting to happen. So that's
Great. Yeah.
which is really good to see, and I mean, it reflects what I was saying earlier about how universities are working together to collaborate to support students going forward.
So what can we do to help with barriers to digital access, right? Not everyone, some of the things we take for granted, like, good computers and a decent internet connection are not available to everyone. And how can we help? And that's one of the roles of schools more generally, but universities as well, is to, in some ways, help level the playing field and provide good studying conditions to everyone who wants to study. How can we do that in this, I don't know the word for it, like devolved and fragmented landscape of teaching that we currently find ourselves in?
I see three potential things that could be helpful. And first of all, I'm going to channel my IT colleagues who were very glad to hear me talk about platform standardization. So we should have something that we can work on, a simple platform that everyone can get access to and make it available as part of the joining of the program if we have to do that. So that's a simple way of getting the kind of the base technology there for people and think about how we invest in that. The second thing is actually to ask for input from our students who are more digitally creative than we are about the ways in which we can be adaptive when we can't have platform standardization. And the third thing, I think, is just to continue basic educational research about what these platforms look like in the future so that we're catching up with the trend and where it might go, if you know what I mean. So those kind of three areas I think would be helpful to look at.
Do we have any more comments?
Yeah, I'll come in there as well. And I guess following on from Paul's point there is understanding exactly how students are engaging with and using the resources that we already have, and that will help us understand how best to ensure that they can access the resources that they are actually using. So there is some research to do around how students are engaging with learning materials that we might be providing them.
Okay, so we need urgent COVID-led research in that area as well, right, Anita? Because it's part of the adaptation to post-COVID world. Okay, so from a practitioner's perspective, another question that's come in is whether good interactive distance teaching is much more time-intensive for lecturers than face-to-face equivalent. And also a related question that has also come in is more from, I guess, the rights of the practitioner's point of view, once we've created this digital content and it's recorded, what's there to stop universities from keeping it and that affecting people's job security?
So can I come in on the lectures and the content? And I think, I suppose this comes back to an earlier comment of mine that actually, that it isn't content and Google-based information that is the heart of a university education. So so yes, a lecture is important, and the information that comes across in a lecture is important. But what is more important is the guided reflection that the lecturer takes the students through when they discuss the material after the lecture, when they work together to write assessments in response to that knowledge that they've gained, and their ability to reflect across a number of different lectures that they've received. So, and I guess it's the marketization argument that you're saying. It's like one lecture. If it was just the lecture that was important about higher education, then I would say, well, there is an argument, but it's not. It's about the entirety of university education that's important. So I have absolutely no worries that that a university would even contemplate keeping lectures and putting lecturers out of work, because it isn't just about the lecture, it's about the whole educational experience.
So the ongoing interaction rather than just the recorded content, right?
Completely.
And I guess to some extent, there's nothing like, you know, not having access to something to suddenly value it a lot more. And I think COVID has taught us that, if nothing else, is that suddenly we really crave the interactions. We can't have them. And the question that came through as well was, you know, some of the things that we do, we can't do online. And it's just not possible. And I think that was something that also Paul's recorded a talk also touched upon, is that there's some skills that we can only achieve by doing, and not everything people can do in their homes, right? So we don't have access to labs and fields and I don't know what else people need to do.
Whatever it is you use in collider physics.
Yes. So
can I come in on this point of recording material and making us redundant? And I know it's already been addressed a bit, but the thing for me is that we should be doing the opposite, and we should all be putting as much of our stuff as possible online, because we want to attract the people who aren't yet students. We want to be able to say, yes, there are TED Talks, but there's a lot of other material that's available within a university context, and it'll do exactly the opposite to making us redundant. I genuinely think people should think that the more stuff you put up, and if it's obviously of a high quality because it's done by academics, then you're going to attract far more people. And you should never worry. I always think in some ways it's related to the point more general academic plagiarism, that, you know, can anybody really replicate your stuff? And you have to have the confidence to say, of course they can't. And you have to have the confidence to say, well, you know, you've put up a lecture, it might be there for a period of time, and then you've developed yourself. You'd now do a better lecture and a better lecture and a better lecture, and engage with the public. Because what I think is surprising, I suppose, about the digital world is how few academics engage with it. So obviously I do a lot of interviews with academics, some older academics especially, and a lot of them, in a couple of cases, they taught me obviously decades ago. And I cannot believe that in their lives, they have never been recorded. And there's no recording of their voice. There's no recording of their expertise. And I think it's terrible. And I think as institutions, but actually as a republic of letters, which is what the academic world is supposed to be, as a republic of letters, we should be putting more and more stuff out there to persuade the people who are not students yet, and to give confidence to the people who are students now, that there's this perpetual stream of expertise, and we should be doing it ourselves. We should be doing it in collaboration with our institutions. And the last thing we should worry about is, oh, they're gonna take my stuff and make me redundant in consequence.
But,
yeah, that's a very.
I think there's a really important point here, which is that a former colleague at Edinburgh University posted the job advert for her first academic job. Some of you may know her, Melissa Terrace, and an equivalent job advert now. And what I found really interesting about it was that she got a job without having finished a PhD and without having been published. It would be almost impossible to get a job in academia without having 3 or 4 papers, a finished PhD and a postdoc. And I think part of the anxiety that many academics have about universities making them redundant stems from the reality that there are a lot of people out there qualified to teach in universities who can't get positions in universities and who go elsewhere, while the staff at universities, and particularly the more junior staff, are being crushed under an enormous workload and finding their lives almost impossible. And I think, while Claire's point that universities I don't think will make academics redundant in this way is correct, I think there's a real lack of trust because of the difficulty that many people have getting their first job, and because of observing people's fellow doctoral students not in academia and having not been able to get a job in academia while people are being crushed under an enormous workload. And I think that's a really big question for the future of higher education.
I mean, absolutely, Peter, but I wonder if that's in some ways a separate problem, and the putting content online might not actually be related to that and be more aligned with the trend that we see definitely in the sciences towards a more open science. And one of the comments that came in was about having also more open universities and what that might mean in terms of the value that universities can provide, not just to the people who are officially enrolled, but to society more broadly as providers of high quality information and high quality knowledge that keeps evolving, right? It's never going to, like, hopefully it's not going to stop. So I wonder if the two things are, I guess related to the points you made before about the worries about automation and the worries that people had when the steam engine came along, and whether those might actually be misguided, because that's not where the real problem is.
So I think I could probably reflect on this a little bit more. I don't know, I mean, all of you probably have been in the situation where a fellow academic is ill or something like that, and you're handed their PowerPoint slides and asked to give their lecture in an emergency. And we all know how difficult it is to pick up somebody else's intellectual thought from the PowerPoint slides, or actually give a lecture that somebody else would give, because it's really hard to put yourself in their shoes. And I think that is a reflection of the individuality that there is round about teaching, and that the concept of a lecture that's online being of a value to somebody else, for them to be able to develop their teaching materials. Yes, it might inform, but I think everybody has their own individual style of teaching. But I agree with you, Maria, in that the debate about somebody feeling threatened at the moment because of the huge amount of work that isn't necessarily having to go on at the moment in terms of developed teaching materials ready for next academic year. That is a massive concern, and it's a massive concern that people are trying to do this work sometimes at home when they've got young children around snapping at their heels constantly, and it's a really difficult situation. It's not an easy situation.
So I guess going back to the worries that people have and the lack of trust, and I wonder if we could take a second to think about early career people in particular, for whom career prospects are suddenly a lot harder, and that job prospects for academics have been increasingly hard, and they're suddenly harder. early career researchers are very much part of the academic community. They're often not involved in teaching, but often that is their sort of long-term aspiration. And what does the current crisis bring for them?
I think that's an excellent and difficult question, obviously, but there are things that we can think about doing as a community. One is to look at what our learning societies and professional associations are doing to provide support for early career academics in their searches and their personal development over this difficult time. The other thing is to think about what our institutions are doing individually about reward and progression perhaps over time. I've got a friend at Boston College, and their entire first year in the business school is experiential. Now, they're not going to do any experiential learning over the coming year, so everyone has had to change everything. And with that in mind, they've changed their progression monitoring from, research and teaching to being teaching and research, recognizing the work that people are putting in, and that work can be an intellectual contribution. So we have to give people ways of understanding how they can thrive in the new contributions they're making, and to value them and show that they're valued, I think, alongside that support from professional associations of the disciplines, so people feel enabled and rewarded in that context. Job market, though, I don't know what we can do. That's a terrible and difficult situation.
Could I jump in here as well? And I guess, that kind of flexibility and understanding of the variabilities that might happen within an academic's career. Some years they may be more focused on research, other years they may be more focused on the service and management responsibilities that they might have. And I'm not convinced that at the moment that flexibility is always there within a system for promotion that does seem to be quite rigid in what our expectations are.
Okay, and another thread that's come in was whether we are listening to our students, and whether we're listening to our students from the point of view of IT issues, but whether or not they are content with learning from home, or whether that is a challenge. Have we asked students what they want, and do we know for a fact that we assume that we know, but we know for a fact that what they value is interaction, and if so, what does that mean for how we actually do our feedback and how we actually manage our interactions?
So, I mean, I'm scared to come in a little bit, but we're there. We've surveyed students about their experience of the remote teaching that was delivered at the end of our semester, and we've also surveyed our students about the online examinations that are going on. Both of those surveys are currently under analysis, but they've been really interesting to look at. So the students have loved online examinations. They really appreciated, I think about 80% of them have really felt supported in going through online examinations, which is very reassuring for us because it was the first time we've ever done such a thing. In terms of remote teaching, they were very happy with everything that all of the academic staff at St Andrews have done to make remote teaching successful. They're very, very clear that what they really value is this type of interaction, to be able to have debate and discussion with their tutors over either Teams or Zoom. So it's personal interaction with their classes that they enjoy. They enjoy less the kind of just one-way presentations of material. So they appreciate the lectures that are online, that they like them, but they enjoy the interaction much, much more. And so their overwhelming message is, if you're going to do anything, can you give us more interaction?
That totally chimes in with what's coming through the chat, as well as the feedback that I've got from my own students, is that they value the most the opportunity to just talk to us, like synchronously rather than asynchronously. It's just not the same, because we get cues from Like, this is not the same as being in the same room, but I still talk with my hands, and you can look at my face when I'm smiling and not smiling. And that's a huge, I mean, I keep hoping that we have a font that highlights sarcasm when I write emails, and that doesn't exist. Yes, there's a lot more to communication than just what we write down, and the ability to have this sort of synchronous interactions, I think, is really essential. And another point that you touched on, Claire, was on exams, and I wonder if we could reflect also on whether COVID has changed what we think assessment is for. You know, do we need to reassess how we assess students post-COVID, or, you know, are exams still the way to go?
May I jump in here, if that's okay? I feel like I'm treading on Claire's territory, so I hope you forgive me.
It's fine, it's good to have
I've written a paper recently for the British Academy of Management to help people think about some of these things. So that's where I'm coming from in this perspective. And I think there is a great opportunity to rethink assessment here and match it to the kind of content and skills outcomes that we're really looking for from each of our classes. Because we tend to get into a tradition, the way in which we assess. And so it's the essay and it's the exam. And forgive me, and don't say I ever said this to anyone, will you, but exams are often a terrible way to assess learning outcomes. And we've got a great opportunity to use less of them. And I think that would be a good thing. So I think innovation in assessment is a real important, strong possibility that's coming through from these interactions and platforms, and thinking particularly about how that matches up with skills outcomes rather than content outcomes. And there's a surprisingly large amount of skills that's woven in amongst our content that's worth assessing differently. So I think it's a great opportunity.
So I think there's a really interesting thing here. In 2002, when I sat in the Quality Assurance Committee at Edinburgh University, we first started considering the impact of students doing most of their essays on a computer and then being assessed at the end of their degree with a piece of paper that they were meant to write on. And the way you do those essays is very, very different. And in fact, as an enthusiastic employer of graduates throughout my working career, I barely ever sat somebody down and said, write all you know about this in 45 minutes, and I'm going to assess you on that. And in fact, it's not an enormous distance from what I would ask graduates to do to what they're being asked to do in the sorts of exams they're being given now, as I understand it. You know, take this away and in 24 hours prepare 1,500 words on the relevant topic. So we're actually getting much closer to an assessment of something that's real world than we were before. And that has all sorts of equalities impacts as well. You know, it doesn't benefit people like me who can formulate arguments very quickly and write very quickly. It does benefit the quality of those arguments, and that I think is probably a very good thing. It's interesting to me that it's 18 years on that we're beginning to get to this, and it's required a crisis.
Yeah, crises are definitely, you know, catalysts for innovation, right? So hopefully COVID will have some silver linings like that. Okay, so a question that's come in is whether we think that universities will become more different or more similar to one another post-COVID.
I have been writing too much recently, and I'm writing a chapter on the future of education, looking at how diversification might come out. So please stop me for going on too much here. I think actually both outcomes are likely. There'll be a focus on the middle ground. If you are Russell Group and you have kind of establishment presence, you will stay there. If you are someone more on the edges, you'll try and diversify. So there's room for, I think, movements in three ways. One is more towards an elite branding. We try and offer something prestige with your experience away from this establishment huddle. Another one is towards expert pedagogy, when you're really investing in the learning technologies and the educational growth that's possible now to think about. And another one kind of goes sideways into edgy creativity, smaller universities that will do things really differently and focus on experience alongside the learning. And there are good examples of that already in some of the non-traditional universities like the Fachhochschule in Germany, and particularly Karlshochschule, where they have really edgy creative style, and have a look at them and see what they're doing. So there are opportunities for diversification, but I think both things will happen. There'll be some move to diversify, but also lots of people huddling for safety around the core at the same time. So
as we sort of move towards innovation and move towards this diversification, there's also a worry that's come in, is what does this mean in terms of impacts on practitioners, and how do we allow the space and the time for people who are burdened with a lot of bureaucracy and with a lot of demands in our time, often, you know, also with carrying demands increase. How do we allow the space for this innovation to actually happen?
Well, I said oh, Peter, go ahead.
At the beginnings of a conversation yesterday about the ref and where we go with the next ref, and I've had a long-standing concern about new public management theories and its implementation in public services. And I think particularly now, it's an extremely wasteful way to assess the value of what's happening. And I think that's really ready for a root and branch review. And I think there would be relatively little opposition from within the university sector to a substantial review of how REF works and a reorientation away from people spending enormous amounts of time. I mean, somebody told me yesterday that they had a professor in their department who'd been allocated 25% in the first year, 35% in the second year, and 45% in the third year of their time to REF. That seems enormously wasteful. And if we could begin to look at what you do in the rest of the world, which is to abstract values from what's being done, not ask people to account for them afterwards, then you could free up enormous amounts of time and resource to do other things with.
I wonder if Richard can chime in here and tell us what we can learn about the future here by looking at the past as well.
Yeah, I think that lots of the things that we've been talking about, what you have to remember is that UK universities have been in crisis for a long time. And obviously I, like everybody, worry about the postdocs and the PhD students and what's going to happen to them. But one point, and I don't think it's necessarily a happy one, is that a lot of people who have got academic jobs now, it's a bit of a miracle. If you think of the 1980s, where the cuts were so savage that the old claim used to be that if you had an interview with 3 people, the 2 good ones at the end of either spectrum where the committee was divided would never get the job, and it was always the person that nobody really wanted, but wasn't going to cause too much strife internally because the universities were so polarized in appointing committees. We've been through that in the 90s, obviously cuts in the 2000s, cuts again. So I think the more general point is that UK universities, because we haven't got a society which says universities are great things. I think if we look at Scandinavia, you know, I have quite a lot of contacts with Denmark and Sweden, and there's no question that the sectors are valued, the sector in general is valued in a way then it's seen to be a social good in a way that it isn't here. And I think that the more general battle that we have to fight on every single front is what can we afford to do, because the pressures are going to be so intense. And obviously lots of people have made that point. And I think it stretches into every area of our lives. And the fact is that for the younger generation of academics, and actually the older generation of academics who might get sacked, who knows what the future will hold, it's going to be very, very tough. And the change to the digital and all the exciting things that it brings with it, it's going to take an enormous amount of time. And the danger is this, which we've all mentioned and we've all said we're against, this more general marketization. And I sometimes read Stefan Collini, who has been somebody who a long time ago, and again, decided that he couldn't stand the ref and couldn't believe that some of his younger colleagues were forced to jump through so many hoops. And I actually think there's a positive side of the ref, because if you look at the way that the universities were when the ref was first created, a lot of people in the former polytechnics said, well, it was the first time that we were really valued for the research that we were doing, because we had the ref. So I don't think anything's ever black and white. But the more general point is, I think that we're not automatically valued as a sector, and we have to do whatever we can to say that this, I've used the term before, republic of letters that we're all part of, that we're as united as possible, and that we provide to students the experiences, which actually I think is much more than just the interaction with the faculty. Obviously, they learn as much from each other together in the same place as they do from us, of course. Anybody would say that. And we need to return to that as soon as possible, and we need to fight our corner. And that means putting as much stuff online as possible to say, this is just really valuable. And what worries me is that certain subjects are going to be privileged post-COVID, and some are going to be identified as window dressing or not even icing on the cake, on the educational cake, and that concerns me.
I think the point that we need to be better at articulating higher education and universities as a common good, rather than a commodity. I mean, through like multiple people have made a comment, and I actually wonder if COVID gives us an opportunity to do that. And to some extent, like we're now seeing the return of the expert, for example, instead of everyone is tired of experts, which we had before. And so I wonder if now is the time to be really vocal and clearly articulate how having higher education and how having a healthy higher education system is essential to make general populations resilient to the change that is definitely coming, right? So I wonder if this is something that we can collectively do better, and how we can do that better. And that was very much part of the original motivation for this event, is contribute towards changing the public perception of higher education in the UK specifically, but also more broadly. Does the panel, like, I want to rant, but does the panel want to comment here as well? Go ahead.
So I think there's a really interesting thing here, and I mean the observation I often make is that if somebody's got a conspiracy theory to peddle, they'll put it free all over the internet. If you've got research that you want to communicate, you put it in a journal that it's almost impossible to get access to. So that needs to be free. But I also think, I mean, universities and public engagement is again something that hasn't had a really root and branch rethink in the last 10 or 15 years in a way that can make the case for universities in our society. And if we want to be loved, we want the university sector to be loved, we need to do something to be loved. And I mean, I think, you know, there are great examples. There's Mary Beard, there's Brian Cox, there are high profile academics, but what do we do in local places to contribute to those places? What is it that we can do to turn public engagement round so that it's not just a few lectures, which are good in their own terms, but which I don't really think reach out beyond the bubble? I mean, to the extent that when I was rector and I used to go to a lot of these things, I began to get to know the 5 people who were at all of them, and it was pretty poor, actually. I think there's a real role for using new media, for trying to engage people in new ways in these sorts of things. And when I talk about changes to the ref, I think that may be one of the areas where you really could begin to get credibility for research, credibility with communities, because appealing directly to people, I think, brings them into a process in a way that the technocratic ref doesn't.
Nikki's chiming in and saying more showing, less telling, more listening, less lecturing. I think that's a pretty good summary of what we maybe need to be doing collectively in the sector.
Can I just say that one of the things that's extraordinary about academics when they are involved in public engagement, and I don't know how many people have been on Melvin Bragg's In Our Time, but if they have, they'll know that what Melvin says to you, Melvin is obsessed with how many people download the programs. And he always says that any episode is downloaded more than any other radio program on earth. And there are literally, 90 million often other figures. I've never looked into it, so I don't know whether he's telling the truth. But it's certainly the case that when academics do things like that, it reaches a broader audience. And I think programs like the Life Scientific is also that's also fantastic. And what I've always wanted somebody to do, not talking to somebody boring like me, but other academics, is the Life Academic. And I think the Life Academic is something that people don't know enough about it. They presume that it's privileged. They presume, you get an easy life and holidays. It's some of the stereotypes that used to be said about, teachers more generally. And we know what's happened, as I started by saying, we've seen the teachers under attack in schools, and few people start a job as a teacher in their 20s and have the energy to continue to the end of their career. Most of them drop out. It's simply too stressful. It's too challenging. It's too difficult to combine with life more generally. So it's a myth that that's an easy life. It's a myth that the academic life is an easy life. And I think, again, that is something, perhaps through a Life Academic a podcast of some kind or some initiative, I think that would be a great thing to tell people how we actually live. Because I only get hints of it, but I think there's a bit of a myth in government that we're the sector that has never really been cut, and that everybody has suffered from austerity, and that somehow, we've avoided it. That's nonsense. But it always worries me. I sometimes worry that a government, a populist government, saying, oh, well, look at their lives, look at their holidays, look how easy they have it, look the proportion of time that they spend doing research, etc. We're an easy tree to axe. And I think that's something that we have to prevent.
So as part of changing public perception, a question that's come in is whether that means that there should be, we can't just talk the talk, right? We have to walk the walk, and whether that there are consequences in terms of how we teach and what we teach, and whether maybe universities need to become more mission oriented in the process, which is something that Peter alluded to in his talk.
Yeah, so I think there's a really interesting there's a broader piece of work here by Mariana Mazzucato, the academic at UCL, although Anton Nascatelli, the principal at Glasgow University, has also written a report on this in a Scottish context. And I think looking at missions and how you might align research and teaching, and this is my spin on it, participation, is I think really important. And actually, the reason I was slightly late this morning was I was at the RSE's post-COVID commission, and we were talking there very much about the ways in which you can get people involved in an evidence-led process that can change public opinions. And I mean, the examples that people are most familiar with are probably those in the Republic of Ireland, where they really dramatically moved policy on equal marriage and on abortion, which were really thorny issues that the politicians were very reluctant to tackle. I think we have some interesting questions at the moment. The one I've been most exercised by is air pollution, where I think people aren't aware of just how significant it is, but you could bring people on a journey to help them to understand that and then begin to get public policy outcomes if you do it in the right way. And I think that's something that would have to come out of a university, and would have to come out of a university in a local context, and could really make a dramatic difference. I think that's something that our universities should be looking at. And I mean, I'm really reluctant to say, here's another thing and university should solve it, because I realize how much pressure there already is. But I think looking at these sorts of things is one of the ways in which you can really prove value. And I think we were talking at the Young Academy yesterday about how it is you could do a participatory futures approach towards easing lockdown and towards moving into a post-COVID world. That really needs the expertise that are only really held in universities, and delivering on that feels to me like a mission of real value, and would be a way to really structure engagement by academics right the way across the disciplines in our future as a society.
Yeah, I fully agree with your point there, Peter. But then Amanda on the chat asks, when do you have the time to do this, in addition to everything else that we also do? Which is a very, very good point to make. But I think you're right that that paves the way for a better society, and it is something that universities can and maybe should be contributing towards. I think we may need to wrap up our discussion here. So thank you very much to everyone who has participated. Don't disappear just yet, because I'm going to hand over to Alice. Maybe before I do that, if people want to, they can clap. I'm going to do that now. Thank you very much to our panel for a really, really interesting debate, and also to everyone who has participated so far for keeping the excellent questions coming. And I've learned a lot, and this has been great for me. And now I'm going to hand over to Alice, who's going to talk a little bit about the next steps, and also try to capture more broadly some of our thoughts, so that we can distill all of this in the report that will follow. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maria, and thanks also to all our panellists for answering so many questions on such a wide range of issues. The discussion's been fascinating. There are so many comments and questions which I've been queuing up and recording, which we're going to use to inform future conversations. And what I want to stress really is that this is very much the start of the conversation today. What we want to do is create an ongoing space for higher education practitioners, for teachers, researchers, technicians, and so on, to carry on debating and having a voice in the future shape of higher education post-COVID, but generally as well. And really an opportunity for practitioners to speak up. I know I kept encouraging you on chat to speak aloud, and I can understand why people just wanted to put their questions in chat, but we really do want to run some more events where we have breakout rooms and where we actually hear everyone's voices, and just really hear from you about what you think the challenges and opportunities that are most going to affect you are. So we are planning some future events, future consultations, very much in dialogue with the RSE, the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And as I said at the beginning, all of that's going to feed into our joint tertiary futures project and the RSE post-COVID-19 Commission. And we're going to be therefore asking you to stay in touch with us. And I'm going to say a little bit about that at the end. But what we want to do now is move to a short Mentimeter survey, just to try and capture what your current thinking is after this sort of discussion, after we've gone through lots of different issues, thought through lots of different scenarios. What we want to do now is just capture some of your kind of key thoughts about the future shape and the purpose of higher education. So Morven, can I ask you to start the Mentimeter slides? For those of you who haven't used Menti before, it's a live interactive survey tool, and in a minute we're going to get a website to go to where you type in a code, and you begin to answer questions. So you go to www.menti.com and you type in the code 352427. And Morven, I'm going to be relying on you to move us on to the questions in due course. And the nice thing about this interactive survey tool is that we actually see the results appear in front of our eyes, so you can see what everyone is thinking. So Morven, can we go to our first question? which is, what do you think is higher education for? We've been talking about this big question all the way through, although we've been drilling down into lots of different aspects of it. And we're just inviting you to type up to 3 words, what you just characterising, all short phrases, what characterising what you think is the purpose, the social value, the future goals of higher education. And the results will start appearing as people type up as a word cloud. Helen, you wanted me to repeat the code. It's at the top of the Menti slide. It's 352427. So some interesting things coming up there, and I think the words that are larger are the ones that are repeated, that are more common things. Interestingly, we've touched on research a tiny bit, but perhaps that hasn't been given as much airtime as some of the teaching aspects of higher education, but that's certainly coming up here. Learning is the really, learning rather than teaching, or learning rather than education, is the really big word that's coming out, but also really very close behind that is critical thinking. But lots of other things. Employment's quite small, social mobility's in there, inspiration, experience, cognitive development, transforming the world, and common good and society are all coming up. I'll give people a few more minutes just to type in their answers before we move to the next question. And while you do, I'll just say we're able to download these from the Menti website, and we will use the responses here just to inform our prioritisation of agenda in the events that we plan for the future. I think probably, Morgan, we're ready to go on to the next question, and this one is a free text question. And this is asking you as practitioners, and I'm assuming that that's what most of you are, because that's how we sort of advertise the event. But if you're not, don't worry, just answer the question, whoever you are. We really want to know what medium-term changes or challenges you're most worried about right now. And that might be as a result of COVID. It might just be generally, it might be things that you were worried about long before COVID popped up. But so if you can start typing in some of the things that you're really particularly worried about in terms of the future of higher education. Ooh, a fair amount of work-life balance coming in, not surprising. And job security cropping up. Diversity is an issue that's just been mentioned here and hasn't, it would have been one of the topics we would have liked to have got onto, but diversity across the piece is a challenge, and perhaps a challenge post-COVID, in particular with childcare responsibilities and so on impacting on women perhaps more than men. Capacity, administrative burden, and ongoing marketisation of higher education, which is very much where we started the conversation. So lots about workload and work-life balance, but also academic identity. That's an interesting one. There's shift in academic identity, perhaps as a result of marketisation, perhaps as a result of different forces shifting what people think higher education is for. Avoiding getting COVID is a good concern to keep at the forefront of everyone's minds. I would agree with that. And perhaps the diversification between the priorities for education and priorities for research within higher education institutions. And the accessibility of universities to at-risk scholars, refugees, and so on is something that's just cropped up. Of course, pending cuts, yes, we're all going to have less money to spend in every area of life, public funding at least, as a result of COVID. So that's a good snapshot of some of the issues that people are particularly worried about. Do keep filling those boxes in if you want. You can come back to this survey later, I think. But Morven, I think in the interest of time, we probably ought to go to the next one, which is what opportunities for positive change are you most excited about? Again, put down as many as you like. We have got a chance with COVID, as we've talked about, to rethink what we do, how we do it, how we organise ourselves, and indeed why we do some of the things we currently do. So it'd be really great to hear what opportunities people are excited about for positive change in higher education. And flexible working is definitely something that I think a lot of sectors have started to notice, that actually, you know, people are finding certain things more stressful about being at home in the pandemic, but some people are also really enjoying the flexible working opportunities that that they've been experiencing, and flexible thinking about how we teach, delivery of learning. Stopping the ref might gain momentum, we'll see. Less travel time. And yes, something that Clare in particular has touched on, this collaboration between universities at every level. It would be interesting to see how much of that survives post the immediate crisis, whether competition and so on trump collaboration in the longer term, but we will see. But certainly some aspirations coming in here for a change from a competitive model to a collaborative model in the sector. And again, the diversity of access, equality of access to different kinds of communities. So some really positive thoughts coming in there. Keep chipping them in for another minute or two if you want. And I think, Morven, we'll move on to the next question. There are only two more, which is a word cloud, and asking people to just jot down up to 3 words or phrases that really capture what you think you need in terms of support for education practitioners in the medium term, especially with all the extra pressures that COVID is now putting on practitioners to deliver top quality but completely brand new types of teaching, emotional pastoral support to students and so on. What support do you need to fulfill your current role, your new roles, and your goals, your aspirations as higher education practitioners? Time is absolutely the biggest right now, and I wouldn't be surprised if it stays that way. And some aspirations about the kinds of management we want. And I think that perhaps chimes with one of the points that Peter made in his video. And if you haven't had time to look at them, they're all available on the Young Academy of Scotland website. Peter was talking about how many universities are still structured in quite a top-down management way that's more like businesses from the 1970s almost. And there are all sorts of other ways in which we can structure our decision-making and our management systems, so that there's more articulation between different parts of the university. But time is absolutely staying the biggest. Reduced paperwork is presumably part of that. Prioritising academic freedom, it's good to see that there. I do sometimes wonder whether we don't talk about academic freedom enough in the discussions we have about the purpose and the value of higher education. That freedom that we sometimes, I think, take for granted to ask difficult questions, which not everyone has, of course. Funding, I'm surprised actually how small funding is. Maybe that's a sort of realization that funding is just not going to be in great supply in the coming years and months. Okay, thank you very much for those answers. We've got one more, and this is really asking you all to tell us, Young Academy of Scotland and RSE, what you would like us to focus on as we continue to plan a series of consultations and discussions, what you'd like us to focus on as a matter of urgency. Now, obviously this list isn't exhaustive, and you're very welcome to chip in the chat box and on our YAVS website, where we've got a feedback form with other ideas as well. But it would be great just to see, you know, just to capture a snapshot of what you think the really, really urgent issues that you would like us to look at next. Of course, they all interrelate, so it's not the case that you choose one in isolation. quite relieved to see funding models low down that list, as not a topic I was looking forward to particularly, partly because there's not much we can do about it at the moment. So employment conditions is very much up at the top. That chimes with the last set of results we've looked at as well, in terms of support people need.
And just to jump in here, Alice, and say that our goal is very much to organise in the future similar events to this, or maybe a slightly different format that are specifically focused on these topics, and perhaps have breakout groups so that we can have people talking to each other, which would be difficult with a group this big. But if we have smaller groups, that we should be able to have actual conversations to do that.
Yes, absolutely. That's very much the aspiration. Again, very much part of, I think one of the things I said right at the start was that we do worry, actually, as an organisation. Young Academy of Scotland tends to represent early and mid-career professionals, not just academics, but all sorts of professionals. And one of the things that has frustrated many members is the sense that it's practitioners, the people at the coalface, who are often left out of important conversations, policy making, and so on. Not always at all, but those voices and that experience we're really keen to amplify by hearing from people in future events. So those results are not surprising. Employment conditions still very much at the top there, but also future teaching and learning methodologies very much at the forefront of everyone's minds right now, as we've been grappling with that transition to digital, fully digital learning, and then look ahead to probably blended learning and teaching in the coming months. Interesting to see structural issues really up there too, and I'm not surprised about that. And then I think this reflects, again, the conversations that we've been having, the relationship between higher education and society, and addressing that. So that's very interesting. Thank you very much for those for filling in those questions for us. Morven, could you pop up our closing slide now? And this is a slide just to invite people to stay in touch or to get in touch with us following this event. As we've said, we want this to be very much the start and not the end of the conversation. And we're really keen that you might share our mentee survey, for example, with your colleagues. It's going to be open for another week to 10 days. I think that's right, isn't it, Morven? Yeah, a minimum a week, possibly 10 days. It depends when the code was fixed. We'd also love to hear from you on Twitter. You can continue the conversation, and as Maria said at the beginning, if you can use our the Young Academy and the RSC handles, as well as the hashtag Tertiary Ed Futures, that will help include lots of different people in the conversation. And our YAS website has got a comments page where we can share, where people can pop in any further ideas, any further comments they've got for future discussions. And please spread the word, because we want to hear from a real diversity of voices. The panel has been very St Andrews dominated today, and that's because we were originally planning this event as one of many, but actually an in-person event. So we were going to have an event at the University of West of Scotland, which had to be cancelled. That was on the 31st of March, and we'll hopefully rerun that with that panel in due course. This was going to go ahead in person, so we had a St Andrews panel set up for a St Andrews event, but we're really keen to hear from people across Scotland and from colleges as well as higher education institutions. So please spread the word amongst people you know. And I do want to end, I'll hand over to Maria again in a minute, but I just want to end by adding my personal thanks to Paul Hibbert and Anita Laidlaw, Peter McColl, Clare Peddie and Richard Whatmore, for their contributions and for fielding so many different questions today. And just to urge anyone who hasn't tapped into their videos, which are on our website, to do so, because they popped out these sort of 5 to 10 minute videos just capturing some of their thoughts about the purpose and future of higher education, and they're very much worth listening to. Back to you, Maria.
I don't really have anything to add here. Just to thank everyone for participating, and our panel speakers in particular, but also everyone who made this a truly interactive experience. Whenever we organize a debate, there's always a danger that there's no questions, and this was definitely not the case. We had lots of questions coming in, and really, really good questions. So thank you, everyone, for that. And I hope we will stay in touch, and we build on the possibility of collaborations that may that we talked about here before. Thank you, everyone.